students, this is Miss Cave, and this is our lesson on converting between fractions, decimals, and percents. So you should have your note sheets in front of you, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So let's look at the first activity we have here. So it's important to note when we're dealing with fractions, decimals, and percents, it's important to look back at a picture so that we really have a good understanding about these procedures that we follow when we're converting. And we're not just following procedures blindly, but we're actually thinking about what we're doing. So like for the first one, you've got this sheet in front of you. I want you to go ahead and try this. I want you to go ahead, pause the video, and I've given you the percent here that matches the picture. I want you to give me the conversion as a fraction, a simplified fraction. And then also we've been working with scientific notation. Let's see if you can go ahead and put that into scientific notation. So go ahead and pause the video, give it a try, and then when you're ready to continue, start playing the video. All right, so our picture, we have our percent grid here. Okay, we know it's percents because it's out of 100. We have 100 out of 100 here total if it was shaded in. So that's our whole. And percents are per 100. So if we count these, we see that we have 20% or 20 hundredths, which is 20%, and that was already given. So as a fraction, we can write this very simply as 20 over 100 because percents are hundredths. Now if we want to simplify a fraction, this should be review, we're going to try to figure out the biggest number that goes into both the numerator and the denominator evenly. So I know that 20 goes into both 20 and 100. And if I divide by 20 over 20, which is the same thing as dividing by 1, I get 20 divided by 20, which is 1, and 100 divided by 20, which is 5. Okay? Our decimal, a lot of times we get into this moving our decimal point to the left and the right, like when we're going from a percent to a decimal, and that's a fine strategy, but let's try to understand where we get it. 20 out of 100, if I read this decimal here, or this percent here, this is 20%, which is the same thing as 20 hundredths. And so when I write this as a decimal, I'm simply writing 20 hundredths because my 2 is in my tenths place, my 0 is my hundredths place. So 20% is the same thing as 20 hundredths, and I can simplify that. I can actually take that 0 off and write that as 2 tenths. All right, now for scientific notation, if you guys recall, this is good review for that. When we're writing a number in scientific notation, we are going to move our decimal point so that the number is between 1 and 10. So my coefficient for this would be 2 or 2.0. And since the number is less than 1, it's going to be a negative exponent. So this is 2.0 times 10 to the negative 1. All right, so I'd like you to go ahead and pause the video and try the next one. All right, let's see how you did. Let's go ahead and take this picture here, and to find the percent, you would count the number of squares that are shaded out of 100. And so I can see that there's columns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's 6 columns of 10 plus the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is going to be 65%. And the fraction for 65%, because percents are how much is out of 100, is going to be 65 hundredths. And now I'm looking to simplify this. I'm going to divide both of these numbers by 5. Okay, and so 5 goes into 50 10 times, so it goes into 60 12 times, and then I have one more with that extra 5, so it's going to be 13. And I did that mentally, but you could do that on paper as well if you aren't as quick with getting it mentally, or you want to check your accuracy. This is going to be 13 over 20, and that's my simplified fraction. So now again, if I'm writing it as a decimal, I want to remember that 65 hundredths, I'm just going to read my fraction over here. If I read my fraction, that's going to help me write it as a decimal. 65 hundredths, which I got from the 65%, is written 65 hundredths. So now that's my decimal, and for scientific notation, I'm going to move my decimal point right here. So I have 6 5/10, and since I moved it, I would have to move it 1 to the left to get it back to its original form. It would be times 10 to the negative first power. All right, how'd you do? Okay, let's take a look at one last one. So go ahead and try this one on your own. Pause the video and then continue when you're ready. All right, so if I look for this as a percent, I have 3 columns this time of 10, 3 times 10, which is 30, and then I have, looks like I have 2 shy of 10, so this is going to be 38 hundredths. Okay, so I'll go ahead and put my fraction in there. I'm at 38 hundredths, which is the same thing as 38%. And I'm going to simplify that. 38 and 100 are both even numbers, so I know 2 goes in to both of them. And 38 divided by 2, I'm going to think, okay, 30 divided by 2 is 15, and 8 divided by 2 is 4, so 15 plus 4 is 19. So it's going to be 19, and then 100 divided by 2 is 50. Okay, and so now moving again from our decimal, I'm going to look at my percent, which was out of 100, because we're going to use this place value to write our decimal, and we're going from a percent to a decimal. So 38 hundredths is simply 0.38. We've got tenths, hundredths place. And then in scientific notation, we move it over 1. Whoops. Move it over 1, and it's 3 8/10 times 10 to the negative first power. All right. Okay, so let's look at the rules and the procedures now that we've looked at it with the picture model. Let's look at what we do when we go back and forth between any of these, because sometimes we're not going from percent to decimal. We might be going from decimal to percent, or fraction to percent, or fraction to decimal, and we need to make sure that we understand the procedure for doing that. So on the next page, this is the answer key, so I want you guys to go ahead and just fill in what you have here, and then once you've done that, we're going to do some examples as we look at this. So go ahead and fill in the top part. When you're going from a fraction to a decimal, you're dividing the numerator by the denominator, so your top number goes in the box when you're dividing, and your bottom number out. All right, you may not quite understand what I mean by that right now, so let's look at a quick example before you go on to the next part. So let's say I want to change I'm going from fraction to a decimal, right? I'm going from fraction to a decimal. So I'm going to think of a fraction. Let's say 3/5. 3/5 is my fraction. And 3/5 hopefully is a benchmark fraction that you do know, but if you don't, what you can do is simply put the top number in to your dividing box and the bottom number on the outside. So what I'm doing is I'm dividing 3 by 5, and if you think about this is just like a division bar. It's like 3 divided by 5. So your top number, the 3, goes into the box. Sorry, that was my cat, you guys may have heard. He's up on the table. He knows he's not supposed to be. Okay, 3 divided by 5. Well, you'll notice here that 5 does not go into 3. Well, this is a number less than 1, so I know I'm going to get a decimal, something less than 1. So I'm going to put my decimal point, and I'm going to move it up here. This is review from probably 5th and 6th grade on how to divide, and I'm going to put 30, because now 5 doesn't go into 3 wholes as it is, so I have to put it into 5 goes into 30/10. That's why I put my 0. And 5 goes into 30/10 6 times. And then 6 times 5 is 30. And then I have no remainder, so now I have my decimal. So that's just a demonstration, and I do want you guys to write this on your notes so that you have an example, so that when you see these words, they mean something to you. So we put our 3 in the box, and then we put the 5 outside the box for my divisor, and then I came up with my decimal, which is 0.6. All right, so now let's say I have my fraction. Now it's a decimal. It's 0.6. And I want to change that to a percent. Well, let's think again what percent means. Percent means out of 100. Okay, so what we're doing, and you're filling this in on your notes, you're going to multiply whatever your decimal is, you're going to multiply it by 100 because percent means out of 100. So basically, if I have 0.6, I want to know how many hundredths would that be. So when I multiply by 100, as we've been practicing with scientific notation, when I multiply a number by 100, or 10 to the power of 2, I move my decimal point over 2 places. So I'm going to take my decimal and move it over 2 places. So now my percent is 60%. Okay, so this is just one example of how you can go from a fraction to a decimal and then convert to a percent. But what if we want to go back the other way? And again, pause the video at any time if you want to take a moment and reflect upon this, or maybe you need to catch up writing everything down. But I'm going to go ahead and look down at the bottom and look at the rest of our notes. So what if we're going from a percent to a decimal? And we looked at that a little bit on the first slide. So if I have percent, let's say I have 32%, and I want to change that to a decimal. So what I'm doing is I have 32 hundredths, okay, so I'm thinking about this, 32% is 32 hundredths, because remember, percents are out of 100. So if it's 32 hundredths, that means if I'm going to a decimal, I can think about this as I'm going to need to divide by 100, so I'm going to take my 32%, I had my percent, and I'm going to move my decimal point over 2 places to the left because I'm dividing by 100. And again, I can think about this. This makes sense. I'm not just blindly moving my decimal point. I know that these are hundredths because it's a, we looked at the grids, the models, because it's a percent. It's out of 100, so 32 hundredths means I move my decimal point 2 places to the left, and so my decimal would be 0.32. All right, and so now when I want to go from a decimal to a fraction, I'm going to use my place value. Okay, so this is really important. You're going to use your place value, and the place value of the decimal is the denominator of the fraction. So we need to remember that. We have our tenths place, our hundredths place, we have our thousands place after that, but for this one we're going to stop at hundredths. So my fraction is 32 hundredths. That's how I write it as a fraction. But normally we want to have our fractions in simplest form. So just like we looked in the other slide, we're going to convert this to simplest form, which doesn't change the value of the number, but it does change the numbers themselves. So 32 hundredths, if we simplify it, it still represents the same part of a whole. It's only the numbers are going to be smaller that we're using. So I know 32 is a math fact for 8. So I'm going to divide both of these numbers by 4 because 8 times 4 is 32. So if I divide them both by 4, I get 8 over 25, or 8/25. All right. So we've looked at a couple of different examples, how you go back and forth between doing your conversions. This is surely a review from 5th and 6th grades. But in 7th grade, we're going to take this a step further, and we're going to learn how to compare and order all of these numbers by using these strategies. So you've got your notes. We're going to go ahead and do a few examples together on the next slide. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make this a little smaller so we can look at our notes as we work. I'm going to go to the next page. Bear with me a moment. Let's bring this up here. There we go. All right. Okay. So now I have my notes with me as I go through and try these strategies. So for the first one, fraction to decimal to percent. Okay, so I can follow this example and just practice. My fraction is 3/4. So my division for that would be 3 divided by 4. So 3 divided by 4. Okay, there's my long division. This is probably one that you know, a benchmark fraction, but we can go ahead and practice. So 4 doesn't go into 3 wholes, but it goes into 30/10. 4 times 7 is 28. And then I get 2. I bring down my 0. And 4 goes into 25 times. And 4 times 5 is 20. And I have 0 remaining. So our decimal for this is 75/100ths. And remember, when we're going from a decimal to a percent, okay, we're going to move our decimal point 2 places to the right because percents are hundredths. This is 75/100ths. Percents are hundredths. So my percent is 75%. All right. Let's take a look at the second one. I have 0.9, and this time I'm going from decimal to fraction. So if I'm going from decimal to fraction, if you look over at our notes, when we're going from decimal to fraction over here, we're going to use place value. So I'm going to think about what is that place value. So this is 9/10. So it's 9 over 10, 9/10, and that's already simplified. But we have our percent missing too, and so when we go to a decimal to a percent, we're multiplying by 100. So since we're multiplying by 100, because they're hundredths, we're going to move our decimal point 2 places to the left. So that's going to be 0, or 90, excuse me, 90%. All right. So we've looked at a few of these examples. I want you to try, and these are due tomorrow when you come to class. I want to have the rest of these filled in as you practice converting between fractions, decimals, and percents. That's it for now. Have a great day.